This week marked the final publication of the Cass Review, something commissioned by the Conservative government in the UK to review trans healthcare for young people. And with its publication came what had begun with anxiety for trans people into a horror story. Because not only is the entire report riddled with flaws and biases, but its publication has been followed by a complete surrender and folding by numerous LGBT rights organisations across the UK and political parties. Most prominently the UK Labour Party, who rushed to confirm that they would approve of everything in the report. Despite the fact that this is a report that rejected 98% of all studies regarding trans youth healthcare, and then coming to conclusions such as this, claiming that any child that is considering going through social transition should be seen by an expert. Can you imagine if the same kind of recommendations were made if a child was to come out as gay? Mum, Dad, I think I like guys. Nope, we'll be having none of that until you've spoken to a psychologist. This is a report that out of hand completely rejects the idea that increasing numbers of people coming forward to clinics could be due to increased social acceptance of trans people, because the increase is just too much. There is no other basis for this claim, despite the now famous chart of left-handedness identification once people stopped being beaten for being left-handed. This is the same study that claims that people should be screened for being autistic because they see being autistic as a potential cause of people's gender dysphoria rather than being trans, as there is a well-researched and long understood overlap between people who are autistic and people who are trans. Guess where else there is this kind of overlap? That's right, left-handedness. But no one is suggesting setting up screening for left-handed people to check whether they're not actually left-handed, they're just autistic. So how could a study with such clearly warped understandings of evidence bases, where it will just reject the majority of research around trans youth healthcare and then make completely unsupported presumptions throughout the rest of it, even come to happen? But it turns out there's been some work put into this, because in Britain, a state whose institutions have widely been gripped by this hysteria around transness, it's not at all surprising to find out that something that's billed as a unbiased, scientific, objective report into trans youth might end up being filled with figures who it turns out aren't particularly unbiased and actually have some history with that. For example, Tilly Langdon, who was warned about as someone who promoted conversion therapy lobbying groups, and despite warnings given to Hilary Cass as she was conducting this report, ended up being given the job of designing the review methodology for the entire report. Or Michael Biggs, who is referenced a few times during the report, who is an Oxford academic. He just happens to be an Oxford academic who set up a sock puppet account in order to insult trans people. Receiving even more references is this Finnish academic. And again, this is a report, an unbiased, objective report that throughout over 90% of the studies on puberty blockers and hormone therapy for trans people struggling with gender dysphoria. And this academic managed to get in several references, several different pieces of work, who is also a key member of the anti-trans movement, who, again, mocked trans people online because apparently that is a key requirement for academic researchers who are taken seriously in British medical reviews, and was a key part in the banning of trans healthcare in the US state of Florida. 50 studies were thrown out because they weren't considered to be up to a rigorous enough standard for this review. 50. One was considered a high enough standard to be considered. This anti-trans campaigner had 4 different academic papers referenced in this report, all of which were accepted at their word as unbiased additions to a report that is now being used to attack trans healthcare across the UK. This case gets even weirder when we look at how they ended up pulling together that academic research, including how they switched away from the usual approach of ranking criteria for research to be included in a study and what kind of research would be thrown out, in order to result in a situation where they dismissed most of the research that already exists on trans healthcare. A last-minute change which, if I was to be cynical, might have been because they discovered that actually a lot of this healthcare approach is very well researched and scientifically backed, which is why it's supported by the vast majority of medical and psychological associations in developed countries. And to show that I'm not entirely unjustified in being cynical about this, Hilary Cass met with the people who were responsible for eradicating trans youth healthcare in Florida, something they didn't even try to hide as being anything but a political act. They explicitly smeared trans people as dangerous threats. They didn't have any real concern about the medical implications of trans youth healthcare. And in fact, after the Cass report's publication, Cass did a Q&A with the Kite Trust, in which she explained that she didn't see any evidence that suggests that hormone treatment for trans youth was dangerous. In fact, suggesting that the use of hormone blockers from the age of 15 onwards is actually too late to be using that kind of treatment. This furious backpedaling in the face of the real impacts of what her report has accomplished, which has been the eradication of trans youth healthcare, comes as Cass herself has done a news round across UK news outlets complaining that she sees criticism of her report as unfair and misinformation, whilst raising no concerns herself that the impact of her report, despite what she has said since about these hormone therapies not posing a danger to trans children, has been used to strip healthcare away from trans children. Not once during these interviews did she suggest that's a problem. Instead, they were entirely focused on, woe is me, how dare people be critical of this flagrantly flawed and biased report, and how it was being used to attack trans people. And the examples of just how biased the report are fairly clear to see. For example, how in sections of the report she discusses just how rare it is for trans people to regret their transition. But instead of seeing this as an incredible success of the measures that are already in place to support people through their transition, and to ensure that for those people who are questioning but may not actually be trans, will not actually go down that path, she instead suggests that hormone treatment for trans youth somehow switches them into being trans as if they weren't before. Something backed by absolutely no studies, and instead is exactly the same kind of fear-mongering that the right uses about people transing the kids. The report goes even further than this with this absolutely ludicrous paragraph, with the suggestion that people assigned female at birth are incapable of saying whether or not they are trans because they haven't experienced becoming women. Functionally saying to trans men, how do you know? You haven't tried being cis yet. Just imagine if anyone who is being cited across our media as a respectable and well-researched professional said this about gay people. How do these men know they're actually gay if they haven't even tried sleeping with a woman? The suggestion is so transparently ludicrous and so unbacked by any research cited in this entire report that it cannot be read as anything but Hilary Cass herself just presenting the biases she came into this report with. But the damage is done with basically our entire media, our entire political operators just climbing on board the concept that this is a completely unblemished report that must be taken at face value and cannot be faced with any critique, resulting in, outside of England, which is the only NHS service which this was actually in reference to, now in Scotland and Wales, trans youth healthcare being stripped back. Despite Hilary Cass, in an interview with an LGBT charity, saying that she didn't believe that hormone therapy for trans youth was dangerous, and she in fact believed that puberty blockers were being used too late. That didn't stop these health services from deciding to just get rid of all of it. And considering the fact they're not even interested in listening to the words of Hilary Cass herself, it is pretty clear they're either doing it because they don't believe in treating trans children, or they are running scared of politicians and media sources who have jumped on the anti-trans train. In the midst of this, Patrick Harvey, the Scottish Greens leader, seems to be the only political leader in the entire UK who's actually standing up to this narrative at all, accurately saying that this report is being politicised and weaponised against trans people.
Do you accept the findings of the Cass report? Do you think the Sandiford Clinic is right to pause the prescription of puberty blockers?
The first thing I want to say about this is, while some people would like to pretend that something like puberty blockers is being handed out like sweeties, we're talking about a very, very small number of young people in Scotland.
They've taken a policy. Do you think it's the right policy?
A very small number of young people who will, at the moment, be feeling devastated that they're not going to get access to the healthcare that they need. Our thoughts, first of all, need to be with them. As far as the Cass report is concerned, whether it was intended this way or not, it has now clearly been politicised by those who are not only trying to abolish transgender people's healthcare,
but do you accept the findings of it? Do you think it's a good report?
And exclude transgender people from a whole host of public places and public services. I want people to be really, really clear. Not only the Scottish Greens, but the Scottish Government are not part of that culture war against transgender people.
Oh, really? Well, against transgender people, but you are part of a culture war. Your colleague Ross Greer described this as a transphobic conservative document.
I've seen very many criticisms of the Cass report.
Do you agree with him?
Things
or do you
like
think that's
the
irresponsible?
evidence that wasn't considered by it and that was specifically excluded from it. And it has clearly been weaponised in the way that's just been described.
So you don't think it's a valid piece of scientific research? Because it was conducted by one of the country's most eminent paediatricians, who, by the way, has now been told it's not safer to go on public transport. Perhaps in part because of comments like Ross Greer's.
Well, certainly not because of anything Ross Greer has done.
He's effectively said it's a transphobic document. That doesn't help matters, does it?
The toxicity around this debate, I've been on the receiving end of that as well. I've been the subject of hate crime because of the kind of toxicity that has been deliberately cultivated in our society as a result of a nasty transphobic culture war. It's so reminiscent of the homophobia of the 80s and 90s, and it taps into exactly the same kind of thing.
Let's move away from the culture war. Just one very specific final question, and I just want to come back to it. Do you accept that the Cass report is a valid scientific document, a valid piece of research?
I've seen far too many criticisms of it so far to be able to say that. There will be a ministerial statement next week about what happens, and I want to be really, really clear that the decision that was made last week was not a government decision. It was made by individual clinicians. And if they need more evidence that what is best practice around the world, and has been the case for a long time, can continue, then we need to work with them to make sure that that evidence is there.
They've made that decision sometime before this report was published, we hear as well. They just took a few weeks to instruct the patient.
For that, one of the most prolific and widely read political commentators in our entire media in Scotland came out and basically called him a threat to children. Everyone in Scotland understands what is meant by calling a man, especially a openly queer man, a wrong-un. The kind of open, dangerous homophobia that has been enabled by this culture of fear and hate against trans people. And in the face of all of this, our media and political ecosystem, even those who say they are allies, who claim to be leading the fight for LGBT rights, most of them have just utterly surrendered, trying to spin the positives of this report that within weeks has rolled back decades in trans youth healthcare. or sitting in shameful silence, or climbing onto the bus themselves to continue this wave of hatred against the LGBT community. In the face of all of that, it is a stain on our media and journalism environment that it has required independent trans journalists to do any of the research into what is actually behind this report. Looking into the research behind it, looking into the kind of people that the report and its author thought were legitimate actors to get involved, all whilst trans people themselves are almost completely frozen out of the process of a report on their own healthcare. A lot of the clips I've shown through this video are from trans journalist Erin in the Morning, whose blog you can find just by searching that term. And I've got a lot of my other information from Mallory Moore, who's active across social media networks. But they shouldn't need to be doing all this work on their own backs. Just do the basics of research into a report having such profound political and healthcare consequences. Where are our investigative journalists? Where are our media organisations who claim to stand for revealing the truth and talking truth to power? Because it seems the moment they feel they can farm more clicks from fueling hate for trans people, they will take that option over real journalism every single time. And I hope at least some members of the profession have the self-awareness and the humility to be ashamed by that. And this time it's the academics getting involved with an open letter signed by 265 academics condemning the Cass report. And I think the letter is incredibly important, so I'm literally going to read the entire thing here, and you can look it up if you feel like it. So, here we go. Letter on the Cass report. As a network of expert feminist academics and stakeholder groups who work on gender diversity, we are dismayed at the recommendations of the Cass Review 2024 for NHS provision of gender identity services for children and young people. The Feminist and Gender Equality Network urges the NHS not to act on these recommendations. We suggest that the Cass Review contains unsound methodology, unacceptable bias, and unsupported conclusions. As academics and experts in the field, we regard the Cass Review as potentially harmful to trans children. As academics with a wealth of research experience between us, we can confidently say that the Cass Review is an inadequate piece of research. Its methodology is unsatisfactory and unreliable. It disregards the wealth of expertise at national and international levels on best practice guidelines to support young trans people. It does not include a proper systematic literature review, since it disregards most research evidence because it fails to reach the impossibly high bar of a double-blind trial. In fact, trans healthcare is inappropriate for a double-blind trial, since you cannot give hormones to one group of people and not to another. This practice would be unethical. Indeed, much medical practice is not based on this kind of evidence. The Cass Review provides very little evidence for its proposals. The evidence it does draw upon is, in the main, anecdotal. In effect, the Cass proposals are largely unevidenced and seem to be based on anti-trans rhetoric rather than medical or scientific knowledge. The failure to systematically include trans people's voices whilst liberally presenting anti-trans campaigners' rhetoric, including those accused of supporting conversion therapy, remains a level of bias that is unacceptable. We regard the Cass Review as methodologically unsound, that it appears biased, despite its reasonable-sounding language, dangerous, and right-stripping in its proposals. If implemented, its recommendations will cause great harm to trans and non-binary young people. This report should be rejected. Trans children and young children deserve so much better. As I said, this has been signed by academics, 265 of them. And I'm just going to read some of the universities they represent. The University of London, the University of Warwick, University of Portsmouth, East Anglia, University College London, University of Barcelona, Portsmouth, Middlesex, University of West London, Cardiff, Oxford, Warwick, Salford, Bristol, Edinburgh, Eastern Illinois, Lincoln, Salford, Leeds, Manchester Metropolitan, Nottingham, Sheffield Hallam, Goldsmiths, Edge Hill, Cambridge, London Metropolitan, Stavanger, Portsmouth, Liverpool John Moores, Virginia Tech, Berkeley, De Montfort, Elon, Hertfordshire, Dublin, Gloucestershire, Oslo, Nottingham-Trent, St Andrews, Universität Berlin, King's College London, Aberdeen, the Open University, Liverpool, the Arctic University of Norway, SOAS University of London, Teesside, University College Dublin, National University of Ireland, Toronto, Birmingham. The list goes on. Next time you see a politician saying on TV, for example, Patrick Harvey or Ross Greer of the Scottish Greens, saying that they see plenty of academic reasons to reject this study, they are not just politicians making a political point on that. They are backed by academics.
Do you accept this report? I have a range of concerns about the methodology used in this report and some of the contents. That doesn't mean that there aren't recommendations in there to welcome, and Dr. Cass was very clear about the need to improve healthcare for young trans people, which I can certainly welcome. But I think it shows a lot of bias from the individuals saying that you cannot possibly criticise this report when there are a range of professionals equally qualified to the review's author who are themselves criticising it. You know, that's an important part of science, to scrutinise and critique reviews and reports. So at the core of this, the Cass review treats being trans as if it's a disorder, and that goes against the best practice as agreed by the World Health Organization in 2019. It uses inconsistent methodology in how it considers different studies. But I think that's all largely besides the point. The key point here is there are really vulnerable young people in Scotland, trans young people in Scotland, who are really hurting right now. Some of my constituents, because they are now not going to get the health care that they were expecting to get, that I think that they deserve, and that those who came before them got. And they need and deserve our support right now. Some of the longest waiting lists in our NHS are for trans healthcare. Trans people have the same right to healthcare as the rest of us. They've just not been getting it. That's what we need to focus on. How do we give them the support they need? And ultimately, clinical decisions are for clinicians, not politicians, but it is our job to scrutinise how our constituents are being supported.
There is a concerted effort in the UK by politicians and our media to insist that the Cass report cannot be criticised on its academic credentials. Not only would rejecting the idea that any paper can be criticised for its academics or its science be an anti-science perspective, as science is created through feedback, criticism and peer review, but it is clear by the sheer volume of academics lining up to criticise this report's academic credentials that it cannot be considered an infallible scientific report. It is clearly flawed, and there is plenty of evidence that it is a biased document with political aims. Aims will do harm to young people in an attempt to prevent them from being trans, which, like all conversion practices, is impossible. All they can possibly do is harm. This report, in all its claims of a lack of bias and objectivity, despite its clear biases, its clear presumptions, and the inclusion of people who are active hate campaigners who show a complete contempt for trans people, has been accepted almost completely uncritically by British journalism, politics, and even some LGBT rights organisations, who lack so much backbone, who are such cowards in the face of this overwhelming assault on trans people across the UK, that they have enabled this hate campaign. They are part of the problem. In the era of increasing desperation and hopelessness for trans people, in the face of a horrific culture war assault on their rights, one that, by proxy, threatens LGBT people and women as well, these organisations have overwhelmingly failed all of us. They are cowards. Whilst trans people, who were cut out of the entire process of this report, not being referenced once as academics or researchers in their own rights, nor was a single one of them allowed to sit on the board of the organisation overseeing this report because they were seen as having too much bias. They have been spending the last few days digging up all the flaws of this report and all the dirt on the people who contributed to it. People that Hilary Cass invited in while still having the nerve to claim this was unbiased, objective and scientific, throwing out 90% of the research on puberty blockers and hormone therapy for people struggling with gender dysphoria, whilst accepting uncritically the work of researchers who show clear hatred for trans people. Those trans people are now doing the hard work of fighting for their own liberation as they're failed by the organisations around them. They've been betrayed by so many, not least the UK Labour Party, whose Health Secretary Wes Streeting leapt to the opportunity to declare he would implement the entirety of the report, every recommendation, so fast that he couldn't possibly have read it. This Labour Party under Starmer has not seen a single pledge it has ever made that it couldn't turn its back on. And after slapping down their own Scottish branch for backing trans rights just 2 years ago, it is entirely unsurprising they have jumped to the opportunity to accept the entire Conservative framing on trans healthcare. We know there is no compromise with trans hate. We know that whenever you give them an inch, they take a mile. And with this latest wholesale surrender of British institutions to a flagrantly biased report, they have wasted no time at all making it clear exactly where they're going next. Because attacking trans youth healthcare was not enough. They intend to come for all trans healthcare. And just like before, British journalists and politicians will roll over to it. The only hope I have, and it's a hope shared by many LGBT people in Scotland, is that at least here the NHS is independent from England, and there is no requirements for the Scottish NHS to follow recommendations made to the English NHS. I just hope the SNP will show some backbone on this, given that they are ruling in a cooperation agreement with the heavily trans-friendly Scottish Green Party.